Magic. Well, thanks. So hi, I'm Mike Shriberg with the National Wildlife Federation. And you know, I might start by destroying some of my own credibility on this by saying I am not an expert on pipeline safety to any degree, which I actually believe was my reaction to Carl when he called me up and said, hey, would you be on a panel at our conference? And fair enough, because I've called Carl many times over the last year and a half. That's how long I've been at the National Wildlife Federation, because I've found myself in the midst of I'd say, a controversy. And this is about a case study, which is at the Straits of Mackinac in Michigan. And I think, you know, one of the things that I want to do here is extract one very specific circumstance, which actually has some things that are highly unique. But what it's taught me as a non-expert coming into this about pipeline safety regulation. And now I've found myself on the Governor's Pipeline Safety Advisory Board and doing some other things that maybe eventually I will consider myself an expert, but certainly not yet on this. This story starts right here, and let's at least be a little bit participatory, because I think we've had a lot of time to talk to. Anyone know what that's a picture of? People from Michigan cannot answer this. What's that a picture of? Anyone know? 2010. Yes, this is the Marshall spill, right? So this is the Kalamazoo River. After the spill at Talmadge Creek, and Marshall's still the largest inland oil spill in U.S. history. That's where our story starts, and it actually starts with somebody in the audience right here, which is Beth Wallace, not only our timekeeper and the Pipeline Safety Trust board member, but actually the staff person at NWF who really brought this issue up by doing this. In the wake of the spill, looking around and saying, okay, what other potential pipeline safety issues are there in this area? Right? And when you look at this map, there's one thing, if you're from the Great Lakes region, I know most folks here aren't, but there's one thing that stands out, and that's Enbridge's Line 5, right? And the question of how Line 5 there, which goes from Superior, Wisconsin, down to Sarnia, Ontario, that's where the end point is there, how it gets across the open waters of the Great Lakes, right? Because it actually starts near the upper peninsula of Michigan, and it goes to the lower peninsula of Michigan. And in between, of course, is the connection between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. This is the Straits of Mackinac. So what was discovered was that there are twin oil pipelines there. And I say discovered because this wasn't, you know, I want to be respectful to the PHMSA friends and colleagues here. It's not like people didn't know this pipeline exists. But I'm saying in the public consciousness, and I would dare say actually in our state regulators' mindsets, people had largely forgotten that this pipeline existed. It actually splits into twin pipelines to cross the 4.5-mile stretch of the Straits of Mackinac. Now, those not familiar with this region, it's hard to overemphasize just how iconic this region is, how important it is, not just for recreational tourism and, of course, the natural resource values, but this is the iconic place in our state, and I dare say our region. Now, I'll give you the example. This is what was and still is in part on the license plate in Michigan. All right, was this view. So that probably tells you a little bit about sort of the iconic nature of this place. And so we being the National Wildlife Federation, started to say, well, what exactly is going on here? What pipeline exists? We found out it's a pipeline from 1953. All right, and did a report, Beth was one of the primary authors of this, that sort of brought this to light. This exploded in the public consciousness. And one of the things I want to say is that this is now, and I'm cutting to sort of the end of this, but this is now not only, I would say, the top environmental issue in the state. That's at least what the state's newspaper had said. And by the way, I'll put the Flint water crisis, which I'm sure people are aware of, in a different category. I don't consider that an environmental issue in that true sense. But the top issue, by exposing this, and then we actually sent divers down to take a look at the condition of the pipeline. Now, this is one lesson, I think, to draw from this, and that's a lesson in transparency. The question that Carl wanted us to ask is, well, what do we want? One thing is actually transparency. This information was not publicly available. People knew very little about this pipeline, and I think one of the reasons that this exploded into such a big public issue was that lack of awareness and transparency, and a couple of iconic images that come from that. Now, I'm fully aware that there are things about oil pipelines that must be kept confidential for security reasons and for business confidentiality reasons. I would submit in doing this work that has probably been used to cover up some things that actually should be in the public consciousness. and that actually leads to more problems for the industry and the regulators over the long term. That's one of the takeaways just from this beginning. Okay, so then we started looking at what would happen if there was an oil spill here. Worked with the University of Michigan, who had the top scientists who just retired from NOAA and went to the University of Michigan at this point to look at if there was an oil spill, what would happen in this area. Now let me point out, this is where we get into the uniqueness of this particular area. There's a uniqueness in regulatory structure. That is that there's a state easement that allows this pipeline to cross because the Great Lakes bottomlands are owned by the state. So there's a different and stronger state role in this than some other parts, just in that portion, not the rest of line 5. But it's also hydrologically very unique place. In fact, the conclusion of the scientists was that it's the worst possible place in the Great Lakes for an oil spill. And that's for a couple of reasons. What you've got here on your left, is Lake Michigan. On your right is Lake Huron. These are two of the largest bodies of water in the world that come together through this narrow point. What that creates is a few things. One, currents that are up to 10 times the strength of Niagara Falls. All right, so think about that. These are intense currents. But there's a big difference here in that they oscillate. They oscillate in not highly predictable manners. So some days it can be going from your left to right, other days from your right to left. Based on weather conditions, it can actually swirl in clockwise, counterclockwise ways. You also have different currents on the bottom, middle, and top. Highly complex hydrology. Very different, and I don't mean to minimize oil spills in other areas, but very different in a river where you can very, with high degrees of accuracy, predict where the oil is going to go. That's simply not the situation here, right? And even different than the oceans where the hydrology is much better known and you have very different forces on it. Right, so I want to point out that piece. So the state began to take this on. The state did a task force report, all right, and this was an intra-governmental report, and I won't talk about the politics too much here, but I will say this was carefully timed when the governor was up for a re-election to actually have the report take it through the election cycle into the next year, all right? So there's the politics on these things matter. I'm not going to spend much time on that today, but I think that's important. And actually came up with recommendations for the straits and statewide. So one of the points here, too, is a particular incident, and many people in the room are very familiar with this, can help change the way the state looks at its own authority in these issues. And so you can see all those recommendations there. I'm going to focus in on the top 4 there, which are specific to the straits. But one of the statewide recommendations was forming an advisory committee on pipeline safety, the Pipeline Safety Advisory Board. I see Craig Pearson in the back for Marathon. He serves on that board as well. There's, I think, 15 or 16 of us on that board at the moment. That's actually charged, it's advisory role, but charged with advising the governor essentially on how to implement these pieces. So we're in 2015 now. I'm bringing the story up to date to 2016 now. We worked with the University of Michigan to do the next level of analysis. Okay, so the analysis I showed you before was actually just looking at the currents. So you could think of that as rubber duckies floating around. This is actually looking at the specific properties of oil and specific spills. And it's a probabilistic map of where you would have oil in the open water. It's where you would have a sheen. On the coastlines, it's where you would actually have oil that would require a cleanup at the NOAA standards levels. That's what this piece is. And we found that about 600 miles of coastline, about 17,000 open miles of open water, square miles of open water, sorry, are at risk from this. That's not from one spill. This is a probabilistic map, right? So you have 100% up here. So if you look, send me a trip, not new technology out, that was up close. Right here, where the pipeline is, and then it gets farther away, probabilities between 0 and 20 for the lighter colors. I'm going to stay here so I don't knock over the technology. Right, so another defining moment, this map was all over, and it still is. It's been in countless hundreds of newspaper articles, I would say, at least on this. Now, at the same time, the state was getting to work on its recommendations. So the state actually has a risk assessment going from DNV. I don't know if folks from that group are here, but a consulting firm that is undertaking a risk assessment to look at a worst-case spill scenario, see what resources are necessary. Part of the issue here is insurance and liability and things like that. There's also an alternatives analysis going on. All right, this is by the company. I always mix this up because the alternatives analysis is done by a firm called Dynamic Risk Assessment, who might have representatives here as well. And this is actually looking at the current pipelines and alternatives to them, everything that could be put on the table. These are reports that are in process right now that will be done in August. These two things will, I think, largely determine the fate of this particular pipeline. It will also make this pipeline one of the most, if not the most highly studied, at least single stretch of pipeline that's out there, the 4.5 miles. The industry folks were telling me it will be the most studied piece of infrastructure that they can think of, at least, in part because that's happening, right? So that was happening now, but in the midst of this, just recently, it was found that Enbridge Energy, who owns the pipeline, was in violation of its easement. Now, the easement from the state says there have to be support structures every 75 feet. Turned out that there were 4 of them that were beyond that. Enbridge self-reported this. This is at least the second time, maybe the third or fourth time, where it's been found where there are support structures too far apart. They also found another 18 that were at risk of being too far apart. Enbridge asked for the permit for this. The state has granted that. The Army Corps has not yet. They said in 90 days the easement will be terminated if this isn't fixed. That's on the clock. That's on the clock right at the moment. The state only granted the permits for the 4 that were already out of compliance. For the other 18, the state, at the recommendation of my organization and many others, decided it's going to take a more comprehensive look. As we said, we're not sure that that 75 feet is actually a protective standard. There are some flaws in the initial calculations, which were done in 1951. Our technology has changed since then. For example, it underestimated the currents, didn't take into account the loading of invasive species that have happened since then, many other things. So the state has said, take that back, and we're going to do a more comprehensive look at this. So that's kind of bringing you up to date on where with this. Now, the focal point has been recently on emergency spill response plans. Now remember, the conditions in the Straits of Mackinac make for, I would say, a unique, we're back to what's very unique about this, I think a uniquely difficult environment to recover oil. You have, this is what the straits look like in the winter, and you know, one of the things to note is it's not usually just a sheet of ice, right? You have like mini icebergs that are very mobile, right? It would actually be, if it was one sheet of ice across the straits, that would be a much different scenario. You have highly mobile ice. You have high wind and waves very often. It's very dark there in the winter. You're pretty far up north. You're above the 45th parallel there, right? So you're very dark, windy, wavy, icy conditions. These are not ideal conditions for oil recovery. And a lot of the emphasis has been on that. And, you know, I'm going to jump to some of the legal pieces of this. So my organization, National Wildlife, has taken the lead now in 2 cases that both directly relate to Line 5, but also get us into the broader discussion. And I should say, maybe I don't need to, you know, emphasize this too much, but we don't take filing lawsuits lightly. I mean, this is something that we spend a lot of time about. We spend a lot of time in negotiations with the DOJ and other folks beforehand, but we did feel like there was plenty of basis to actually file suit in this. So there are 2 cases that are currently pending, one NWF, and we've now been joined by 2 of the local tribes there, the Grand Traverse Band and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe versus PHMSA, and Enbridge has joined PHMSA on that one. And the second case is NWF versus directly as Secretary of the Department of Transportation. I'll explain the difference in just a minute here. And you know, again, I will say I'm going to stick to just the facts of the case. While also not an expert on pipeline safety, I'm also not a lawyer. I'm saying a lot of things I'm not up here, but I just want, you know, so I'm going to stick pretty carefully to what's in the public filings on this. So with PHMSA, there's 2 legal bases for the lawsuit. One is enforcement of the Endangered Species Act and NEPA and the Clean Water Act as amended by the Oil Pollution Act. With the Secretary of Transportation, it's really about the Clean Water Act and the Oil Pollution Act. Here's the basic claim on the Endangered Species Act. Simply that the federal agency did not do the required consultation and inventorying with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the case of a spill. So we went through it, looked at those requirements. Here's a picture of some of the invasive species that are present in this area. And you know, our claim, just to boil it down to the non-technical, was that they simply weren't taken into account with potential oil spills. That's our claim in there. The second is on NEPA, and simply that there wasn't a full EIS prepared to actually look in these emergency spill response plans. We claim that it met the threshold and that it was not prepared. Right, so those are my very, very basic summaries of that. And then the final claim under the Oil Pollution Act, which of course is under the Clean Water Act, It requires owners and operators of onshore and offshore pipelines to get approval of the facility response plan from the federal entity with approval authority. Our contention is that PHMSA actually only has authority to approve onshore pipelines. The Secretary in the Department of Transportation has actually never delegated its authority for offshore pipelines. Offshore pipelines, in this case, this is our assertion, right, would actually include any pipelines on navigable waters. Straits of Mackinac are an extreme example. You have 4.5 miles of crossing of navigable waters, but this actually applies to every navigable waterway, and that the Secretary has not given the authority for this, and therefore the emergency spill response plans are inadequate and incomplete. That applies to pipelines across the country. That's the piece. Boy, I'm getting the time mark. So, okay. I know. From Beth, no less, from Beth. So that's all right. This is my last slide. So the latest piece on this, just from Tuesday, we added a filing on this with PHMSA because what we found here was that actually the oil spill response plans were found in the record, and this was a record submitted to the court, to be inadequate for some pretty significant reasons. I mean, this isn't, I'm not talking just administrative, so these are reasons such as inadequate accounting for material for spill responses. That's what was in the record. The next thing in the record was spill response plan is approved. There was nothing in between. Now, there may be actions that happened with the agency in between, but actually in the record there's nothing there. And we don't know whether this is something that's throughout the country, whether this is something that's common or not, but we're looking at this specifically at line 5. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there and just say this one case study, I think, taught us a few things. It taught us a bit about transparency. It taught us a lot about emergency spill response plans, and it's actually led to many discussions in Congress and elsewhere about whether the emergency spill response planning process is adequate. And it also, I would say, led us to belief of, does the agency, does PHMSA have adequate resources to actually respond to all these emergency spill response plans and all the pieces on there? So sorry, I really rushed that through the last few minutes, but thank you very much.